Glory to see. Okay. So I'll just start off with an opening question. When did you first each hear about the road, and what was your reaction or your response to what you heard? Kathy, we'll start with you.
My history with it goes back to when I was a junior in high school at Druid Hills in 1964. My parents got a letter from DOT telling them that Ponce de Leon was going to be widened to take the first three houses on Barton Woods Road to create the Stone Mountain Freeway. And at that time, people didn't know that they could fight eminent domain, and so it was just accepted that the Stone Mountain Freeway was going to come through. So fast forward through college and graduate school and purchasing a house in Inman Park in 1972, I was involved in what was happening with planning for the Great Park and what would eventually potentially replace the plans for a road. And of course none of that came to fruition. So when Andy Young announced the Presidential Parkway, I had been pretty intimately involved with all of the various plans through the years, and was at the meeting at Ruth Wall's house when Young announced this great plan of how much we were going to love the Presidential Parkway, and ignoring the fact that it was an expressway and we weren't going to love it. And so I got involved at that point in 1982 with the Presidential Parkway version of the plan.
And that meeting that Andy, was an in-person meeting with Andy?
No, he came to a neighborhood meeting that was held at Ruth Wall's house on Hurt Street. Flew in on his helicopter and had Paul Moldauer and the team from the city, and Paul Moldauer was the architect who had drawn up the plans, and I think they were all just shocked that we didn't buy into it, love it, and thank him for bringing us this plan, because we kept asking questions about the width of the lanes and how it looked like an expressway to us, and he was assuring us that no, it was going to be wonderful. And so that's when more questions started and the neighborhoods organized, and it took about that was in January of 1982, and in August or September of 1982 Caution was formed, which was the organization of the in-town neighborhoods to fight the road. Has someone told you what Caution stands for? Citizens Against Unnecessary Thoroughfares in Older Neighborhoods. And it was Inman Park, Candler Park, Lake Claire, Little Five Points, Druid Hills, Ponce Highland, and at that time Virginia Highlands and East Lake.
And I think
that's right.
Decatur as well.
Well, the city of Decatur, was a part of it. Yeah.
And Al, for you, when was your first?
My first word of that was, I didn't live in the neighborhood when all this was happening, but I was up in the Midtown area and I was involved in the NPU system. And so it must have been shortly after what Kathy is just describing. I'm sitting there at the NPU meeting where they're trotting out the plan around the city to sell it to the NPUs around the city in calendar year 82. And it came to NPU E, which is where I was at the time, and we all looked at it and said, by then there must have been enough public rumblings. Essentially, we just said, whatever the folks down in that NPU think, which was good because that was exactly where Caution was. And we just said, no, we're not going to endorse this over.
Right.
So as the battle engaged, what were some of the things you did, responses that you had to, because there was a lot of powers at the same time, but Caution was primarily lawsuits, and then the politics was a lot of the same network, but not through Caution. How
Well, the things that I was mostly involved in were neighborhood organizing and working on the parties to get different people elected to office, and of course the primary concern was that they were opposed to the road. And I went to demonstrations, and my parents lived in Druid Hills, and my mother called me one morning, I think it was at 7 in the morning, and said, get dressed and get over to Candler Park. DOT's here, and they're gonna cut down a tree, and Danny Feig is in the tree. You've got to get over here. And my parents had never been involved in any kind of demonstration or anti-government, and they were out there, and so I went to that and ended up being a little bit more involved, but I was on the zoning review board and I couldn't get arrested. I didn't think that that would be very helpful, so I worked behind the scenes and passed out a lot of flyers, and the legal committee needed runners, and so I often would take the legal documents and distribute them to other lawyers on our volunteer team or to people in the neighborhood or the various neighborhoods who needed documents. And I often would call people to find 20 people to show up in court, and we had what was called a phone tree, and one person who needed people to show up for a demonstration or a court date would call 1 or 2 people, and then those 2 people would call 2 more, so that we were able to spread the word pretty quickly. And one of the things that's so fascinating about this whole time period was that we were doing all of this without fax, without iPhones, without tweets, without any of the mechanisms that would make life so much easier now. And we were somehow able to organize people pretty quickly by using the phone tree. And we had a group of people who we knew that was interested in, you know, being warm bodies in a courtroom, and who would be willing to go and sit in at a demonstration or go to DOT meetings. We had a group that was always at the monthly DOT board meetings, and they were held throughout the state, and I went to several of those. We also had a court in Athens when we went to the Georgia Supreme Court, and we organized carpools to have people in the court. So I did a lot of the behind the scenes until they talked me into being Caution president, and I ended up serving as president for 2 years, and then Al followed me as Caution president at the end after during mediation, and I guess I was president through mediation, and then Al took over when we got into the design phase for the road, for the parkway. Yep.
And so your involvement was mostly Caution too?
Yeah, so my more active involvement, I had been involved as a neighbor, supportive, and gone to some of the demonstrations and wrote my check every year, and there was all kinds of, among the efforts was fundraising, and I was just one of the donors. I can't take any credit for organizing it, but I was writing my checks, which, you know, for young folks raising families and renovating old houses, writing that check in the early to mid 80s was a substantial commitment. I mean, it doesn't seem like much now. You talk about $50 check, $100 check, but it took a lot of those to fight these legal battles.
Right.
Folks were writing those checks to help do that. But my more involvement came as we were getting into the mediation. Just before the mediation, I guess I became an Inman Park rep to Caution, and then I was on the board, and then as president during post-mediation, the negotiation of and signing the settlement agreement. So actually, Kathy and I are the signers of the settlement agreement on behalf of Caution, and then I was on the board as we then took it from the settlement agreement, which gave us unprecedented involvement in the design of the road. Caution met on a regular basis with DOT as the road was being designed, including walking the right of way, and weekly meetings. We will walk the right of way, blueprints, you know, this big around of what the road was going to look like, and flipping through those blueprints and understanding where's it going to be here. Is it higher? Is it lower? Is it making a turn? The mediation had come out of it fairly detailed specs on what the road was going to be, but there was still a whole lot of details to fill in. And so then my involvement came through that, and then into actually, as we were raising money and spending money to actually develop Freedom Park.
Well, Al and I spent a lot of time, we would go to the American Roadhouse for coffee with these DOT engineers, And it was pretty obvious that DOT engineers only design freeways and expressways. And we had to convince them to bring an engineer down from the Rock Creek Parkway to talk to the DOT engineers about how, yes, you can narrow lanes, and yes, you can have a curve. And Al and I would walk out. Many days it was cold, icy, very unpleasant days to be tromping through the right-of-way. And we'd look out over the vista and say, yes, you can put a curve in here. Yes, get a little bit more curve. And we ended up with maybe a 5%.
Something
And
like that.
DOT was acting like they were giving us the world by putting in a 5% curve in this roadbed. And when they would much prefer having a straight line, because then traffic can move faster. But as part of the settlement agreement, they could have no trucks. The speed limit was limited to 40 miles an hour, and there were going to be no exit ramps, access points, and no bridges. So we wanted to slow the traffic down, and the only way to do that was with a little bit of a curve. So we had fun manipulating, maneuvering, cajoling DOT into looking at this not as the expressway they had originally planned, but to come up with something that was a lot more neighborhood friendly and at grade.
And one of the key things, which is interesting because today nobody would realize it, as you get off of the interstate and you come up to Boulevard, the prior highways, as we refer to it, the stub that had been there where they had originally contemplated Stone Mountain Freeway, went under Boulevard and kept going. It was going to contemplated it would go under Highland, Glen Iris, et cetera, which would have been a much faster road. And the reason that the road comes up to Boulevard now is to slow traffic down. Engineers
With a
said, well, you can
traffic
slow
light.
people down with a hill.
Right.
So it brings it up that hill.
So, but years before this, by this time you had been in the negotiations, and Edith
Right.
Prim was the mediator? Is that
Right, I was as president of Caution, I was on the mediation team with Richard Ossoff, Gail Waldorf, and our attorney Rob Remar. And the mediation was organized through the Justice Center, which ironically Jimmy Carter had created. And Edie Prim found our mediator in Boston, and he came down and conducted the mediation sessions. And it was I thought it was a very interesting process that all of the parties agreed to take back any ideas without judgment. And to have DOT and the City of Atlanta agree to that kind of negotiations, we thought was fairly landmark. We never anticipated that we would get DOT into a room where they would listen to the neighborhoods and then respond by going back to their offices, and I don't know that they took it to the board of directors, but at least to talk about it with the engineers. But the same thing had to happen from the neighborhood standpoint. When DOT or the city presented an idea, we had to take it back. And so it meant a lot of neighborhood meetings and a lot of hashing out ideas. And some neighbors were very angry at us. One of my neighbors threatened to sue me. And sue me? I'm a volunteer. How are you going to sue me? And we just promised as part of this mediation process that we would review all ideas. If you don't like it, we'll take it back and say no, but at least we were promised that we would be fair about the process. And through that process, 54 hours of mediation, we were able to come up with a settlement agreement that we then took to each neighborhood. And Gail and I went to all of the neighborhoods, had meetings. I think you went to some of those, and got a unanimous vote from each of the neighborhoods supporting the settlement agreement.
And I think part of what made the whole thing work, and part of the key to that process and the way that Caution handled mediation, was the openness, the transparency, the fact that all the neighborhoods knew what was going on. These ideas that were being proposed, they weren't deals being cut behind some closed door. The
Right.
idea would be, and that we had, up till that point, Caution's history had been the neighborhoods all stood together as a unit, and we had a simple mantra: stop the road. We didn't have to get into any more details. We didn't have to agree or disagree on any of the how we would stop the road. Well, now that we were actually talking that we might actually stop it, those details had to start getting worked out. And so I think the secret sauce that helped us make it work was we said that if it wasn't acceptable to one neighborhood, it wasn't acceptable. Period.
Right.
And so that was, I mean, we all knew that we were working together with some inherent tensions. I mean, the road could have gone a different way, could have been configured differently. There are lots of ways it could have played out that
Right. Well, and there were
could have been very
there were
difficult and
different-
contentious.
Yeah, there were different plans we looked at, and we brought them all back, and we were very transparent and very fair about the process. And through the years, that was one of the things that held us together, was that we were never Druid Hills having their own little neighborhood meetings, figuring out what was best for them, or Candler Park figuring out what was best for them. We weren't doing any of that. When anybody would ask, well, what if? We'd say, no, we're not going there. We're going to wait. We're fighting a battle now. We have lawsuits to finalize. We have fundraising. We have demonstrations. We have rallies. Participate, but we're not going to start second guessing and coming up with solutions before we're actually called upon to do that. And of course, our ultimate goal was to have no road. And in mediation, being court ordered by Judge Seeliger from the DeKalb County Superior Court, we felt obligated to the court to then go in and mediate a resolution. And that ended up with a road, but not as onerous as one that had 5 bridges and had tractor trailers and high-speed traffic going through the neighborhoods. Because we all felt that having bridges dividing the neighborhoods would mean that our neighborhoods wouldn't survive. And our ultimate goal was to protect the historic quality of these in-town neighborhoods.
So there was a time that the city council, Atlanta City Council, passed an ordinance, 45 miles, no trucks, and grade crossings, right? And DOT immediately went into DeKalb Superior Court to condemn those conditions, right? Isn't that when they really showed their hand that they wanted an interstate?
That's a little.
Remember that. Or maybe it may have been. I'm not saying
There
there
was a
wasn't. I don't remember
resolution,
that.
but
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. I may have that.
You might be right. There may have been a resolution.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
there were so many different City of Atlanta resolutions. Sometimes they would be, when Andy Young was mayor, the resolutions were against the neighborhoods. When Maynard Jackson was mayor, the resolutions were supportive of the neighborhoods. So we had different resolutions, and the legal team would be a better one to talk to about some of those early, like Joseph Drolet and Sally Dorn. Sally, I think, more intimately, because she helped write some of those resolutions and ordinances.
Cool. I was speaking. I was just gonna give it another clap. Did you cut or you still?
I kept rolling just because.
Okay, cool.
Because she was talking.
Yeah.
So was there a low point where you thought maybe all hope is lost?
There were several low points.
Numerous setbacks.
Right, when we were in the, what is the Fourth Circuit Court?
Fifth Circuit.
Judge
At that point, it would have been
Judge
the Fifth Circuit.
Fryer, no, the judge he was Fulton County. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. When we were in all morning, and it sounded like the questions that the judge was asking were leaning in our direction. We broke for lunch, and after lunch, the whole demeanor of the courtroom changed. And we had no idea what had happened, but the judge ruled at the end of the day. He had 5 points. The first 4 sounded like they were in our favor, and that the final word was going to be that we won. And the final one, therefore, I'm ruling in favor of the, of the road. I can't remember what that case was about, but that was a huge low point because we really thought that we were making headway in the legal system. There were.
You may remember what event it was, but when I was talking to Joe earlier, he was remembering that right before the Cox folks came out for their worry about the ice off of their tower, we were kind of at a point that we said, well, what else can we do legally? And I don't remember what had failed at that point.
Well, I think that we had 20 or so lawsuits in Fulton County, DeKalb County, state of Georgia, and the
federal courts,
Fulton
too,
courts as well, and even went to the Georgia Supreme Court. And so when we would lose, there was definitely low points there. I'm a little fuzzy on what all those cases were.
Well, so one of them, for
but
example, was when one of the cases had to do with could DOT condemn the park that had been dedicated to the city for park use with some sort of in perpetuity type language. And we won the legal battle in the sense that the Georgia Supreme Court said DOT couldn't condemn the court. So then what they did was they went back and they amended the Georgia Constitution to create a condemnation authority that could condemn a city park. To my knowledge, that condemnation authority has met once.
One time. That one meeting.
And it met to condemn that park. I guess the authority still exists. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know whether
But
that exists or
so that
not.
was one of those
Well,
legal setbacks, that. But in terms of, this is sort of going the other way, but in terms of legal niceties, ironically, WSB and Cox and all those had been strong critics of the neighborhood's efforts, but it was their legal battle over their radio tower that bought us a year at a time when those who were involved might say we didn't have any other legal bullets to fire at that time. And they bought us delays just by virtue of their own.
We had, we were having some difficulty raising funds but we didn't know quite where to go. And it was, that was right before I took over as president. And there was some confusion, frustration, what do we do next? And so we were just continuing during that time to work on campaigns. And I think Ruth talked to you about the number of parties that she had in her home. And we had them even in the Candler Mansion. And we were just intent on continuing to get people elected to office who might be able to help us, and that we know that politically things do change through time. And that gave us a year to work more on some of those campaigns. And
I think ultimately it was politics that, I mean, it was a legal settlement, but it was politics that changed it. When the powers that be at the state capitol said, get this issue resolved.
we had a rally at the state capitol that we named The Time Has Come, and we got I think 44 elected officials to sign that it's time to end this controversy. And we have pictures in the rotunda and with some of those elected officials, and Lieutenant Governor Pierre Howard was there. And I think the governor understood that it was time to stop this controversy. The Olympics was looming, and to have protest at the Olympics was not going to be favorable to the city. And the governor saw an opportunity, and he brought in, well, at this point, mediation
Hadn't happened yet.
was coming, and the governor, well, it was when the governor appointed Shackelford.
appointed Shackelford before the mediation was, I don't know if it was before
no,
it was
Hal
ordered.
Reeves, Hal Reeves was commissioner
After
when we
Moreland.
were in mediation. And I think we had the rally that summer and had, because Shackelford was the new commissioner who came in August of,
So maybe it just
89,
as that transition,
was
as
all
the mediation
happening
was
then.
happening, just before,
And-
just after, somewhere in there, we changed commissioners.
right, the governor was Zell Miller. And there were 4 things that he had charged the new commissioner with, and one of them was to end the road fight. He didn't put it in those words, but that was one of the 4 challenges for the new commissioner, to end it, to get us moving forward so that we could resolve it. And that's why we went back for more mediation at the end of the summer. And we were trying to determine that summer, when we ended mediation with failure, of what kind of lawsuit we were going to bring forward, and had this event, and the mayor brought in a new commissioner. We had no idea that anything that favorable would happen, but that was a glorious day. And then Shackelford was the one who we went back to mediation with, and he helped us end it then.
And-
Brought DOT with a different perspective. Okay, we're not going to be hardline anymore, and we are going to end this.
And in the meantime, previous to that, but the city politics had changed with
Right.
Maynard Jackson coming back in as mayor,
Right.
shifting from the Andy Young administration pro-road to the Maynard Jackson administration anti-road
Right.
approach.
Right, and the first thing that Maynard had done when he came to office was basically announce to City Council that that road was not going to get built. And we
He
had,
brought in a new commissioner of planning
right,
who helped with that.
Leon Eplin was very helpful with that process. And it was a whole new regime that was, it gave us a renewed energy and renewed excitement about trying to figure out how to make the road go away. And we had worked with Maynard in his first term on the Great Park Plan, when he had planned on having 7 museums or event spaces in the abandoned 219 acres. And that was one of the ideas that we looked at, in addition to the Randy Rourke plan, the other plans for housing. And so Maynard had always been our best advocate and strong neighborhood proponent, and very strong. He created the NPU system, and he was most helpful. And of course, John Lewis was on City Council at that time, and as was Bill Campbell, who represented Inman Park. And they were all very pro-neighborhood and helped us work through the city system.
Well, y'all are such a wealth of information. We'll probably have to do another.
I think we're
Time
to
Time to go.
But I do
Yeah.
want to ask one thing. What did you learn about yourself through this? Anything surprise you about what strength you drew on?
I could work full-time, raise a family, volunteer and volunteer and volunteer. Yeah, it was. I never knew that I had the ability to spend so much time working on a project with such passion and have it come out so favorably. Of course, we were all very young when we started. I was very young when I bought my house in Inman Park. I was 23, right out of graduate school. I didn't know much of anything about buying and renovating a house, working, none of that. So it was a lot of growth as well as self-discovery.
Yeah, the value of persistence and teamwork. That this road fight wasn't Kathy, it wasn't me. There are legions of people that it wouldn't have been successful without the work that they did. I mean,
Well, that's
yes, you
absolutely
need
true.
leaders,
Yeah.
but the leaders don't do it by themselves, especially in the days before social media and all that. I mean,
Right.
you could have never waged the kind of battle that was waged without many, many people in
Right.
their hours that they gave.
Right. We had 3,000 people that attended one rally when we went to DOT to give statements about the environmental impact statement.
That was at the Civic Center.
At the Civic Center. DOT had never seen that kind of a turnout. We, of course, turned it into a big event and had a big party. And DOT was just absolutely floored. But it was that core 3,000 people who created change. And it wasn't one person. It wasn't 10 people. It was 3,000 plus people. And then there were all those people who were writing checks who never got involved other than writing a check. And we had a lot of those because we think we raised probably $900,000 through the years. Some of it in kind, some of it through going out and soliciting family members. And the Inman Park Festival, Candler Park activities, neighborhoods donated. So it was definitely a group effort.
It's very impressive, and I'm very thankful for what y'all did.
All 3,000 of you. Thanks.
Probably more than that.